This excerpt from Industrial Society and Its Future introduces a critical view of industrialization and its impacts, asserting that the Industrial Revolution, despite its advancements in life expectancy and material conditions, has led to social, psychological, and environmental degradation. Here's a breakdown of the main points. 1. Critique of industrialization's impact. The author views the Industrial Revolution as a disaster that destabilizes society, undermines personal fulfillment, and subjects people to indignities. Psychological and physical suffering, especially in less affluent countries, are presented as consequences along with ecological harm. The passage suggests that ongoing technological development will exacerbate these issues, implying that industrial progress inevitably leads to greater harm. 2. Survival versus collapse of the industrial system. The author offers two future paths for industrial society: survival or collapse. If it survives, a grim scenario is painted where society might reach stability, but only after severe suffering and the degradation of human autonomy, as people would become cogs in the social machine. The author is skeptical about reform, suggesting that human dignity cannot coexist with an industrial technological system. 3. Advocacy for revolutionary change. The text calls for a revolution against the industrial system, aiming to dismantle its economic and technological foundations rather than merely changing political leaders. This revolution could take various forms, whether violent or peaceful, rapid or slow, and its goal would be to eliminate the underlying structure of industrial society, not simply to modify it. 4. Selective focus on issues. The author mentions that only certain negative developments of industrial society are covered in this piece, particularly those lacking public attention or in need of a fresh perspective. Environmental issues are acknowledged but largely omitted here, possibly to concentrate on less discussed aspects of industrial impact. Overall, this introduction outlines a perspective that industrial society inherently leads to human and environmental degradation. The author presents revolution as a necessary, albeit challenging, solution to break free from an inescapable cycle of suffering perpetuated by technological advancement. The excerpt from The Psychology of Modern Leftism introduces a critical analysis of what the author identifies as modern leftism, framing it as a symptom of a deeply troubled society, and suggesting that understanding leftism's psychological underpinnings can reveal broader societal issues. Here's how these ideas expand upon themes raised in Industrial Society and Its Future. 1. Framing leftism as a psychological phenomenon. The author describes modern leftism not as a unified ideology, but as a psychological type with distinct tendencies, specifically feelings of inferiority and oversocialization. This approach shifts leftism from being seen as purely ideological or political to being partly defined by psychological traits, implying that leftism's motivations stem from inner, possibly unconscious responses to modern society. This perspective on psychology parallels the earlier piece's emphasis on the psychological toll of industrial society, as both texts view modern structures as producing discontent and internal conflicts. 2. Evolution and fragmentation of leftism. The author notes that while leftism was once synonymous with socialism, it has since diversified into various movements: feminism, animal rights, etc. The implication is that modern leftism has fractured, perhaps losing ideological cohesion and becoming more a reflection of psychological tendencies than a solid ideology. This fragmentation suggests a shift in leftism's role in society, from collective political action to more individualized, psychological expressions of dissatisfaction, similar to the alienation industrial society allegedly fosters. 3. Psychological tendencies underlying leftism. The author identifies two main psychological tendencies, feelings of inferiority and oversocialization, as central to leftism. Feelings of inferiority are attributed broadly to modern leftism, while oversocialization is noted as a feature of a smaller yet influential subgroup within it. These psychological factors, especially inferiority, align with the earlier piece's suggestion that modern society reduces individual autonomy and dignity, driving people towards social movements as an attempt to reclaim agency. 4. Broader critique of modern society. Both excerpts criticize the structures and ideologies that emerge in response to industrialization. While the first piece challenges the technological system's degradation of human and environmental health, this piece scrutinizes the psychological adaptation, leftism, that some people develop in response to societal issues. Together, these views suggest that the industrial technological system not only harms people externally, but also shapes internal identities, beliefs, and psychological patterns in ways that reflect its problematic nature. In summary, these excerpts introduce two complementary critiques of modern society. Industrial Society and Its Future examines the external, structural impacts of industrialization, while The Psychology of Modern Leftism delves into how these impacts might shape internal psychological responses. Both imply that modern society drives individuals towards psychological states and social movements that are, in their view, symptomatic of a deeper disconnection and degradation rooted in industrial technological development. In this third excerpt, Feelings of Inferiority, the author delves into the psychological foundation of modern leftism, focusing on the supposed role of inferiority complexes in shaping leftist behavior and ideology. Here's an analysis of how this complements and expands upon the previous excerpts from Industrial Society and Its Future and The Psychology of Modern Leftism. 1. Inferiority as a defining trait. The author argues that feelings of inferiority, comprising low self-esteem, guilt, and self-hatred, are central to the psychology of modern leftism. This psychological framework suggests that leftists are not only responding to social injustices, but are also driven by personal emotional needs. The claim that activists often interpret neutral language as derogatory reveals a hypersensitivity attributed to this inferiority. This aligns with the broader critique in the previous excerpts that leftism is rooted in a complex psychological reaction to modern societal pressures, rather than solely in ideological convictions. 2. Criticism of political correctness and sensitivity. The text describes political correctness as an extension of leftist inferiority, particularly noting that terms once neutral are perceived as derogatory due to activists' sensitivities. The passage argues that leftist hypersensitivity and political correctness are less about genuine offense and more about projecting inferiority feelings onto language and social symbols. This criticism implies that leftists' reactions are exaggerated responses to a societal framework they feel oppressed by, expanding on the earlier point that industrial society degrades personal autonomy and dignity. 3. Anti-individualism and collectivism. The author contends that modern leftists, feeling powerless individually, seek strength through collectivism and large movements. This collectivist tendency is presented as a psychological compensation for personal inadequacy. This fits within the overall critique in Industrial Society and Its Future, where individual autonomy is portrayed as undermined by industrial society. Thus, the collectivism embraced by leftists is interpreted here as a response to feelings of inferiority exacerbated by societal structures. 4. Hostility toward success and rationality. The author argues that leftists despise success, power, and Western civilization because they view these traits as threats to their sense of self-worth. Rationality and science are seen as threatening because they create hierarchies of truth and competence, which leftists supposedly resist due to their deep-rooted inferiority feelings. This complements the earlier critique of industrial society's dehumanizing effects, suggesting that, for leftists, opposition to these strong institutions is less about moral principles and more about personal emotional needs. 5. Masochistic and self-destructive tactics. The author describes leftists' use of masochistic protest methods, such as lying in front of vehicles or provoking aggression, as expressions of self-hatred and inferiority. These tactics are viewed as more than strategic choices. They are seen as fulfilling emotional needs tied to self-perception. This analysis aligns with the general theme of psychological distress in the modern world, presented in the previous excerpts, where both industrial society and its dissenters exhibit symptoms of psychological strain. 6. A critique of activism as emotional expression. This passage argues that leftist activism is not always rationally targeted to improve societal issues. Instead, activism is viewed as a conduit for expressing hostility and achieving a sense of power, often to the detriment of those they claim to help. This critique contrasts the public rhetoric of compassion and morality with the claim that leftism's driving forces are inferiority and resentment. The author posits that activism, especially when adversarial, can worsen social tensions rather than alleviate them, aligning with the earlier theme of unintended negative consequences that industrial society and its offshoots purportedly create. 7. Generalization with exceptions. While the author acknowledges that not all leftists fit this psychological profile, this generalized analysis serves to portray modern leftism as largely motivated by underlying emotional insecurities. This framing parallels the deterministic view in industrial society and its future that the industrial technological system inevitably shapes society's psychological landscape. In summary, this third excerpt expands upon the previous two by adding a detailed exploration of the emotional drivers behind modern leftist activism. Together, these texts suggest that the industrial society not only degrades human dignity and autonomy, but also fosters psychological reactions, such as inferiority and hostility, that manifest in modern leftism's beliefs, tactics, and collective behaviors. This narrative presents a bleak view of both industrial society and the movements that arise in opposition to it, positing that both are, at root, responses to a deep-seated social and psychological malaise. This excerpt introduces oversocialization as a concept to describe individuals, particularly leftist intellectuals, who are so intensely molded by society's moral standards that they struggle with deep-seated guilt, powerlessness, and frustration. This perspective aligns with prior discussions of inferiority, reinforcing the idea that some modern leftists harbor feelings of inadequacy, which are exacerbated by their strict adherence to society's moral expectations. The main points in this section argue that oversocialized individuals feel a profound need to align with society's moral code and often internalize guilt for even harboring thoughts or actions that deviate from societal norms. This oversocialization, according to the argument, not only limits personal freedom, but also drives a unique form of rebellion. Rather than rejecting society's core values, oversocialized leftists advocate for societal improvements, like racial and gender equality, while simultaneously critiquing society for failing to meet these ideals. This paradoxical alignment reveals a form of rebellion that doesn't truly challenge society's foundations, but instead presses for stricter adherence to its ideals. The argument also posits that such leftists may unconsciously desire to assimilate marginalized communities into dominant societal structures, as seen in their support for reforms like affirmative action. Although they claim to support cultural preservation, this support allegedly only allows superficial expressions of culture while pushing deeper alignment with mainstream, system-aligned values, e.g., academic success, professional attainment. Interpretation and analysis. This idea of oversocialization reflects a critical view of moral conformity that contends leftist activists are trapped by societal values even as they seem to challenge them. This conformity supposedly produces cognitive dissonance, manifesting in anxiety, guilt, and internalized self-restraint, which limits genuine rebellion. By this view, leftist efforts for equality are seen less as radical and more as a demand for society to walk its own talk, adhering more closely to its professed ideals. The concept ties into inferiority from the prior section by suggesting that oversocialized individuals experience low self-worth and powerlessness due to the impossibility of perfectly fulfilling societal expectations. As they continually fail to achieve their internalized ideals, they may redirect their frustration into leftist activism, wherein advocating for societal reform becomes a means to alleviate personal inadequacies. The analysis implies that the oversocialized modern leftist's activism is therefore more about coping with personal guilt and self-esteem issues than genuinely challenging societal norms. Together with earlier ideas, this segment presents modern leftist activism as an extension of internal psychological struggles with society's complex moral expectations, where the perceived self-inferiority and intense need to conform to moral ideals result in paradoxical attempts to push society toward its own established values. This section introduces the concept of the power process, a human need for a structured progression toward goals that involves effort, achievement, and ideally some measure of autonomy. This process is portrayed as essential for psychological health, as it provides individuals with purpose and a sense of accomplishment, helping to ward off negative feelings like boredom, depression, and low self-worth. The analysis begins by distinguishing the power process from mere power. Using a hypothetical example, a person who can obtain anything instantly would likely experience initial pleasure, but ultimately descend into boredom, listlessness, and depression. This example suggests that power without challenge or effort yields emptiness rather than fulfillment, as seen historically in certain aristocracies that, due to their wealth and lack of challenges, often became hedonistic or demoralized. In contrast, those who must actively strive to maintain their power remain mentally engaged and satisfied. Human beings universally have goals, often as basic as securing food, water, or shelter. However, individuals who can fulfill these needs without any effort, like the leisured aristocrats, experience dissatisfaction. Lack of meaningful struggle deprives them of engagement in the power process, which leads to mental stagnation. Conversely, those who face continuous failure to achieve their goals, especially non-survival-based ones, experience frustration, which can compound into defeatism, depression, or low self-esteem. The argument thus far suggests that the act of working toward goals, even more than achieving them, provides humans with a deep sense of purpose and satisfaction. This framework might also connect with previous ideas about inferiority and oversocialization. Modern leftists, as described earlier, could potentially be stymied in their power process by feelings of inadequacy or guilt, and they may turn to activism as a way to regain control and purpose. This pursuit of social change offers them a sense of striving, though. As previously noted, their goals often align with societal values rather than breaking from them, potentially limiting their autonomy in the power process. In this broader context, the power process is positioned as a vital, underlying drive for all people, irrespective of ideology, whether it's through activism, career goals, or even survival pursuits. The satisfaction derived from setting, working toward, and achieving goals is essential for psychological well-being. This section introduces surrogate activities, or pursuits that individuals engage in to create artificial goals, particularly when their basic needs are already met. The analysis argues that while such activities provide fulfillment, they differ fundamentally from pursuits rooted in necessity, as they serve to simulate the satisfaction derived from more organic, survival-based efforts. This concept builds upon the power process discussed earlier, suggesting that when people do not have to struggle for basic needs, they create alternate goals to fulfill a similar need for challenge, exertion, and accomplishment. The concept of surrogate activities can be illustrated through historical examples. Emperor Hirohito, instead of falling into hedonism, dedicated himself to marine biology, a pursuit not tied to any survival necessity, yet providing him with purpose and fulfillment. Other aristocrats throughout history pursued literature, hunting, or the display of wealth, signaling their search for challenges or achievements in the absence of physical needs. A rule of thumb for identifying surrogate activities is offered. If someone spends significant time on a goal that they wouldn't miss if survival-based tasks fully occupied their time, that goal likely qualifies as a surrogate activity. For instance, a scientist like Hirohito would likely not miss marine biology knowledge if his time was consumed by survival efforts. Conversely, the pursuit of intimate relationships is considered a real goal rather than a surrogate, as most people would still feel unfulfilled without it. The section further explains how modern society, which requires minimal effort to satisfy physical needs, naturally leads to a proliferation of surrogate activities. With basic needs met, people often turn to surrogate activities. Scientific research, corporate advancement, artistic creation, sports, or social activism to experience a sense of purpose and autonomy. These pursuits, however, are typically driven by the desire for fulfillment rather than survival. For example, many scientists report that the fulfillment they gain from research is more significant than the material rewards. Yet, surrogate activities tend to provide a restless form of satisfaction. The pursuit itself, rather than any endpoint, becomes the primary source of fulfillment, leading people to constantly seek new goals. This is evident in behaviors like continuous wealth accumulation, problem-solving in science, or pushing physical limits in athletics. This dynamic points to an inherent dissatisfaction, suggesting that surrogate activities do not fully replace the fulfillment of survival-based goals, particularly because people do not meet their basic needs autonomously, but instead operate as parts of a larger social system. Autonomy, it's implied, is an essential part of genuine fulfillment that surrogate activities attempt but often fail to fully replicate. In the broader context of the document, surrogate activities may be viewed as society's response to an environment where survival needs are easily met, resulting in a search for purpose that aligns with modern society's values. This pursuit of artificial goals intersects with themes of oversocialization and the quest for autonomy, especially within the educated classes or intellectual circles who, lacking survival-based struggles, often channel their energies into intellectual, activist, or artistic endeavors. This segment explores autonomy as a crucial element in the power process and its impact on psychological well-being. It asserts that autonomy is essential for most people to derive fulfillment from the pursuit of their goals, suggesting that autonomy, having personal direction and control over one's efforts, is a primary source of self-esteem, confidence, and a sense of personal power. In contrast, lacking autonomy or working under strict orders can stifle these feelings and hinder the fulfillment of the power process. The role of autonomy in the power process is nuanced. While full autonomy may not be necessary for everyone, a small group environment where individuals can collectively make decisions and direct efforts often satisfies the need for personal agency. This is in contrast to large organizations or rigid hierarchical systems where individual contributions are minimized, leaving people feeling like cogs in a machine. For many, this lack of personal influence over goals contributes to feelings of insignificance and disrupts the power process. Certain individuals may feel less need for autonomy, either because their drive for personal agency is weak or because they derive a sense of identity from association with a powerful organization. There are also individuals who find satisfaction in roles that prioritize obedience and physical power over autonomy, such as soldiers who gain fulfillment from executing commands rather than making independent decisions. However, for the majority, autonomy within the goal-setting and attainment process is a critical factor in mental health. The document emphasizes that lacking this element can lead to a range of negative psychological outcomes, including depression, low self-esteem, frustration, and even dysfunctional behaviors. In connection with previous sections, autonomy in the power process is part of a broader commentary on modern society's structure. With rigid, large-scale institutions and the prevalence of surrogate activities, opportunities for genuine autonomy are limited. This societal setup often relegates people to roles where they have little control over their actions or outcomes, contributing to the dissatisfaction, alienation, and psychological struggles observed in contemporary life. In this section, the document attributes various modern social and psychological issues to conditions and disruptions unique to industrial society. It suggests that the stressors and frustrations prevalent today stem largely from living in environments and under conditions that diverge significantly from those of early human existence. Primitive societies, despite their challenges, generally did not experience the same psychological stress, suggesting that the current social structure imposes unnatural stresses that contribute to modern mental health crises. Key factors identified include excessive population density, isolation from nature, rapid social change, and the dissolution of small, tight-knit communities such as extended families or villages. While earlier societies also experienced dense populations and rapid change, the document argues that individuals then had more autonomy and control over these changes. For instance, pioneers in 19th century America created change on their own terms, satisfying their need for the power process by building communities through collective effort and personal investment. Conversely, modern individuals often feel that change is imposed upon them by external forces, leaving them with a sense of powerlessness that disrupts their engagement in the power process. The analysis also points out that in modern society, personal and community loyalties are often subordinated to loyalty to the system for industrial efficiency. This often results in the breakdown of traditional bonds and the emasculation of small-scale communities to align with system requirements. This shift, according to the document, has alienated people from naturally supportive social groups, further intensifying feelings of isolation and lack of autonomy. The document concludes that, while social issues have existed in every civilization, modern industrial society exacerbates these problems. It attributes much of this to the thwarted need for the power process, where individuals lack autonomy, meaningful goals, and the sense of direct impact. This analysis suggests that leftist ideologies, particularly in recent decades, may partly represent an expression of discontent arising from this deprivation of autonomy and engagement in meaningful, self-directed pursuits. This passage critically examines how modern society disrupts the power process, or the need to autonomously achieve meaningful goals that require effort, which is fundamental to psychological satisfaction. The analysis distinguishes three categories of human drives: those easily met, those requiring effort, integral to the power process, and those inherently unsatisfiable. Modern life has tended to relegate basic needs into the first category through technology and convenience, while pushing some essential drives, like autonomy, into the third, unattainable group. Key insights. 1. Artificially created needs as substitutes for meaningful effort. Industrialized society compensates for the lack of real challenges by manufacturing artificial needs, encouraging individuals to chase consumer goods and societal standards that demand effort but ultimately serve as distractions. This replaces natural, purposeful struggles with surrogate activities, often leaving people feeling unfulfilled, an observation supported by existential critiques of mid-20th century society. Number 2, lack of autonomy and overregulation. A central disruption to the power process is the control exerted over individuals by societal systems, limiting autonomy. Most jobs, particularly at lower levels, require obedience rather than initiative, reducing opportunities for self-determined effort. Entrepreneurs and small business owners experience a restricted autonomy due to regulatory and economic structures that hinder individual control. 3. Unachievable drives, leading to frustration. Many significant aspects of life, such as personal security, are largely controlled by distant entities, leaving individuals powerless against risks from complex societal systems. Unlike in primitive societies where individuals had direct control over survival challenges, modern threats are imposed by others and are largely outside personal control, breeding frustration and a sense of helplessness. 4. Transitory drives, suppressed by modern norms. In addition to structural issues, societal norms also prevent individuals from fulfilling instinctive impulses, like aggression or independence, in everyday scenarios. These impulses, which would once have been outlets for the power process, are stifled by necessary rules, further hindering psychological fulfillment. 5. Permissive but superficial freedom. Modern society allows superficial freedoms in inconsequential areas, but controls individuals' actions on issues that impact the broader system, maintaining control indirectly through both regulation and subtle social conditioning, such as consumerist propaganda and implicit obedience. 6. A misguided obsession with youth and longevity. As individuals are prevented from experiencing the power process in meaningful ways, they substitute the struggle for purpose with an excessive focus on appearance, health, and youth. In primitive societies, life stages are marked by necessary, real goals like hunting, child-rearing, and communal responsibilities, leading to a more natural acceptance of aging and mortality. 7. The paradox of modern solutions to unfulfillment. The proposition to create opportunities for people to achieve goals within society does not resolve the problem, as these opportunities are ultimately provided and controlled by the system itself. True fulfillment requires autonomy, the freedom to independently seek and meet goals without external provision or intervention, which the system cannot genuinely offer without relinquishing its control. Conclusion. This section presents a profound critique of modern industrial society's impact on human psychology. arguing that many of society's conveniences and protective structures deny individuals meaningful engagement in the power process. By removing direct challenges and self-determined struggle, society creates conditions ripe for dissatisfaction, purposelessness, and existential malaise. The implication is that to restore fulfillment, individuals would need genuine autonomy to engage in meaningful efforts, creating or pursuing their own paths independently, rather than within the constraints imposed by the modern system. The excerpt titled, "How Some People Adjust," explores the various ways individuals in industrial technological societies cope with the absence of autonomy and meaning in their lives. The author categorizes individuals based on their susceptibility to advertising, social conditioning, and surrogate activities, as well as their willingness to identify with larger movements or organizations to fulfill their need for personal agency and power. Key analytical points. 1. Variation in power drive. The author opens by suggesting that differences in how people experience psychological distress in society may be tied to the strength of their power drive, the intrinsic need for autonomy and self-determined achievement. Those with a weaker power drive are labeled as docile and seen as more adaptable to societal structures, potentially at the cost of personal agency. While controversial in its expression, this idea implies that people with lower autonomy needs may find fewer issues with conformity, which the author critiques as passivity or contentment with servitude. 2. Satisfaction through status seeking. Certain individuals derive fulfillment from social or career advancement, with the status ladder serving as an ongoing power process. The author implies that this focus on status is a form of adaptation to the industrial technological society's constraints by channeling one's drive for achievement into externally sanctioned goals, i.e., promotions, recognition, which may alleviate but not fully satisfy the drive for personal power. This is characterized as a form of goal mimicry that achieves social approval but may lack personal fulfillment. 3. Susceptibility to advertising. The analysis divides individuals based on their susceptibility to consumer culture and materialism. High susceptibility. Such individuals are seen as trapped by consumerism, perpetually dissatisfied despite material wealth. Low susceptibility. These individuals resist consumer pressures and as a result find their needs unmet by material acquisition, leading them to search for meaning in other forms. Medium susceptibility. Here, individuals find some satisfaction in working for consumer goals, but may experience frustration from limited autonomy, especially if they are required to follow orders. This implies that consumerism offers an incomplete, though sometimes functional, substitute for self-determined goals. 4. Identification with large organizations. For many, joining powerful organizations or movements provides a vicarious power process. By identifying with the goals of a political party, corporation, or nation, individuals feel a sense of agency, even if their contribution to these goals is minimal. This phenomenon, according to the author, was exploited historically by regimes seeking mass loyalty and is a tool of societal cohesion. However, the author asserts that this identification fails to satisfy the authentic need for autonomy and power in most people, suggesting that true satisfaction can't be achieved by proxy. 5. Surrogate activities as distractions from existential goals. The author revisits the concept of surrogate activities, or pursuits that serve no existential need but provide psychological fulfillment. Activities such as bodybuilding, sports, or stamp collecting are framed as distractions from unmet existential goals, despite individuals dedicating significant effort to them. This extends to careers where people invest far beyond necessary means to satisfy an internal drive through artificial goals that contribute to the system's growth and reinforcement, potentially to the detriment of individual freedom. 6. Deficiency of autonomy and control. The author argues that despite these coping mechanisms, most individuals are only partially satisfied within the system. The regulatory nature of industrial society imposes constraints that leave people with limited autonomy, compelling them to restrain natural impulses and accept limited agency. This inability to attain genuine fulfillment is seen as a systemic issue that no amount of surrogate activity or identification with organizations can fully rectify. Number 7, critique of surrogate fulfillment. Even if the majority of individuals could achieve fulfillment through surrogate activities or organizational identification, the author fundamentally opposes this outcome. They argue that these avenues are demeaning, as they divert people from achieving real goals in favor of system-prescribed activities. Thus, the author's critique lies not only in the perceived insufficiency of these coping mechanisms, but also in their belief that modern society's structure undermines meaningful individual agency. Thematic implications. The excerpt reinforces the author's overarching theme of alienation and dissatisfaction in industrialized society, where personal goals are often supplanted by goals imposed by the system. The concept of the power process remains central, with individuals attempting to satisfy it through substitutes that fail to provide true autonomy or meaning. In critiquing the very mechanisms by which people attempt to find fulfillment, the author implies that society's structure inherently prevents authentic personal development. Societal context and broader commentary. This segment aligns with existentialist critiques of modernity, questioning whether societal structures have truly advanced human happiness or autonomy. In dividing people by their adaptations to the system, the author suggests that most avenues available for personal agency are insufficient substitutes for genuine self-determination, echoing concerns found in existential philosophy and anti-capitalist critiques. The emphasis on surrogate activities and identification with larger organizations also draws on criticisms of nationalism, corporatism, and consumerism as forces that dilute personal purpose in service to systemic stability. Relevance and critique. While the author provides a stark and critical perspective on modern society's adaptation mechanisms, there are notable biases and generalizations within the text. The framing of individuals with less autonomy-driven motivations as docile or complicit risks oversimplifying human psychology and motivation. Additionally, the critique assumes a universal preference for autonomy and purpose-driven action, which may not be uniformly applicable across different cultural and personal contexts. However, the analysis raises pertinent questions about modernity's impact on personal autonomy and the quality of life, inviting further reflection on the roles of consumerism, employment, and identity in contemporary society. This section ultimately challenges the reader to consider whether modern life truly fulfills the individual's intrinsic need for agency, or if it merely offers substitutes that reinforce the very structures limiting personal freedom. This section presents a critique of what the author perceives as the illusion of freedom in industrial technological societies. His argument hinges on the concept of real freedom, which he defines as control over one's life circumstances without interference from large organizations. He asserts that many rights, such as freedom of the press or economic freedom, are largely symbolic, engineered to maintain the functioning of the societal machine, rather than fostering true individual autonomy. The author's key points can be summarized as follows. 1. Defining freedom. He distinguishes between what he considers genuine freedom, self-sufficiency and autonomy over life's essentials, and what he terms bourgeois freedom, rights and freedoms granted within prescribed boundaries to maintain societal structure. 2. Structural determinism. He argues that societal structures, like economic and technological systems, limit personal freedom more than any formal rights or governmental systems. Historical societies allowed more individual freedom because they lacked the control mechanisms that modern technology and bureaucracy afford. 3. Power in the media. The author sees freedom of the press as hollow for most citizens, as the media, controlled by large organizations, drowns out individual voices. He implies that real freedom is compromised by an environment where only system-compatible messages gain visibility. 4. Bourgeois freedom versus FC's conception of freedom. He criticizes the concept of freedom as a means to serve societal needs, bourgeois freedom, favoring a view of freedom that prioritizes individual autonomy and satisfaction of personal goals. He also accuses theorists like Bolivar and Hu Han-min of constructing social theories as surrogate activities, imposing systems that benefit theory makers over the individuals living within them. 5. False consciousness of freedom. He concludes by suggesting that people may believe they are free simply because of societal conditioning and social norms, which could prevent them from recognizing their real needs or constraints on freedom. The author's discussion reveals a consistent theme that industrial society constrains real freedom through structural and psychological means, making people unaware of their limitations. He presents his conception of freedom as involving real autonomy over life's fundamental aspects, contrasting with a bourgeois view of freedom that subordinates individual autonomy to the needs of society. In broader terms, the author's critique fits into his overall view of modern life as alienating, marked by surrogate activities and a reliance on systems that limit human potential and autonomy. By juxtaposing real freedom with what he views as societal manipulation, he aims to underscore what he sees as the futility of attempts to achieve true autonomy within industrial society. This theme aligns with his skepticism about reforming the technological system, as he posits that any reform merely reinforces the structures that restrict true individual autonomy. This section establishes what the author presents as principles of history, which frame his understanding of societal evolution and change. He argues that history follows predictable long-term trends, with significant shifts only occurring through revolutionary, not reformist, means. This deterministic outlook forms the basis of his critique of social reforms and organized attempts to direct society towards specific outcomes. Here's a breakdown of the 5 principles and their implications. 1. First principle: stability of long-term trends. Small changes cannot permanently alter a long-term trend. Instead, these trends return to their original course unless the change aligns with the trend's natural direction. The author illustrates this with political corruption, suggesting that cleanup efforts often revert to previous conditions unless part of broader societal shifts. The principle implies that reform movements are ultimately temporary, emphasizing the author's belief in the persistence of structural trends unless deeply challenged. 2. Second principle: interconnectedness of social change. Any change significant enough to impact a long-term trend will also alter other aspects of society, as all parts are interrelated. This principle positions society as an integrated system, where one alteration ripples across various domains, reinforcing his idea that societal elements cannot be changed in isolation. 3. Third principle: unpredictability of large-scale change. Significant societal changes carry unpredictable consequences due to the interwoven and complex nature of societal components. He argues that understanding and predicting these effects is impossible without empirical precedents, furthering his skepticism about engineered societal change and supporting his argument against deliberate attempts to create new societal models. 4. Fourth principle: impracticality of designing new societies. New societal models cannot be devised in advance and made to function as planned, as human societies are too complex to predict in terms of behavior and interdependencies. This principle reinforces the unpredictability of change and questions the practicality of utopian or theoretical societal designs. His assertion here builds on the idea that theoretical frameworks can't account for real-world complexities, so attempts to design societies on paper are bound to fail in practice. 5. Fifth principle: evolution over rational design. Societies do not form by deliberate choice, but through a process of social evolution beyond rational human control. This is seen as a consequence of the previous principles, emphasizing that society's shape and direction are determined by evolutionary processes rather than conscious decisions. Illustrative case: the American Revolution. To support his principles, the author discusses the American Revolution, arguing it was not a true revolution, but rather a significant political reform within an existing trend toward representative democracy. He claims that American society did not deviate from its trajectory, but instead accelerated toward a model that Britain and other British-descended societies were already adopting. By interpreting the American Revolution this way, he reinforces his view that most major changes occur within the scope of long-term historical trends. Flexibility and use of the principles. The author notes these principles as rules of thumb rather than absolute laws, allowing for exceptions and interpretation. He advises that while these principles guide historical understanding, common sense and empirical evidence should inform their application, suggesting a critical view of both historical trends and future possibilities. Analysis and implications. In framing these principles, the author offers a deterministic view that limits the role of individual agency and reform in creating substantial change. This determinism implies that human effort is generally futile against entrenched historical trends, underscoring his overall skepticism about modern attempts to reform or reorient society through conscious planning. He views social evolution as a complex process that defies simple interventions, preferring broad, natural shifts over planned, incremental changes. In broader terms, the principles serve as a rationale for the author's rejection of reformist or utopian endeavors, positioning history as an autonomous force that shapes society irrespective of human intentions. This framework ultimately reinforces his critiques of modern society, suggesting that efforts to influence or reshape it are largely illusory and constrained by deeper, immovable forces within historical trends. This section establishes what the author presents as principles of history, which frame his understanding of societal evolution and change. He argues that history follows predictable long-term trends, with significant shifts only occurring through revolutionary, not reformist, means. This deterministic outlook forms the basis of his critique of social reforms and organized attempts to direct society towards specific outcomes. Here's a breakdown of the 5 principles and their implications. 1. First principle: stability of long-term trends. Small changes cannot permanently alter a long-term trend. Instead, these trends return to their original course unless the change aligns with the trend's natural direction. The author illustrates this with political corruption, suggesting that cleanup efforts often revert to previous conditions unless part of broader societal shifts. The principle implies that reform movements are ultimately temporary, emphasizing the author's belief in the persistence of structural trends unless deeply challenged. 2. Second principle: interconnectedness of social change. Any change significant enough to impact a long-term trend will also alter other aspects of society, as all parts are interrelated. This principle positions society as an integrated system, where one alteration ripples across various domains, reinforcing his idea that societal elements cannot be changed in isolation. 3. Third principle: unpredictability of large-scale change. Significant societal changes carry unpredictable consequences due to the interwoven and complex nature of societal components. He argues that understanding and predicting these effects is impossible without empirical precedents, furthering his skepticism about engineered societal change and supporting his argument against deliberate attempts to create new societal models. 4. Fourth principle: impracticality of designing new societies. New societal models cannot be devised in advance and made to function as planned, as human societies are too complex to predict in terms of behavior and interdependencies. This principle reinforces the unpredictability of change and questions the practicality of utopian or theoretical societal designs. His assertion here builds on the idea that theoretical frameworks can't account for real-world complexities, so attempts to design societies on paper are bound to fail in practice. Number 5, fifth principle: evolution over rational design. Societies do not form by deliberate choice, but through a process of social evolution beyond rational human control. This is seen as a consequence of the previous principles, emphasizing that society's shape and direction are determined by evolutionary processes rather than conscious decisions. Illustrative case: the American Revolution. To support his principles, the author discusses the American Revolution, arguing it was not a true revolution, but rather a significant political reform within an existing trend toward representative democracy. He claims that American society did not deviate from its trajectory, but instead accelerated toward a model that Britain and other British-descended societies were already adopting. By interpreting the American Revolution this way, he reinforces his view that most major changes occur within the scope of long-term historical trends. Flexibility and use of the principles. The author notes these principles as rules of thumb rather than absolute laws, allowing for exceptions and interpretation. He advises that while these principles guide historical understanding, common sense and empirical evidence should inform their application, suggesting a critical view of both historical trends and future possibilities. Analysis and implications. In framing these principles, the author offers a deterministic view that limits the role of individual agency and reform in creating substantial change. This determinism implies that human effort is generally futile against entrenched historical trends, underscoring his overall skepticism about modern attempts to reform or reorient society through conscious planning. He views social evolution as a complex process that defies simple interventions, preferring broad, natural shifts over planned, incremental changes. In broader terms, the principles serve as a rationale for the author's rejection of reformist or utopian endeavors, positioning history as an autonomous force that shapes society irrespective of human intentions. This framework ultimately reinforces his critiques of modern society, suggesting that efforts to influence or reshape it are largely illusory and constrained by deeper, immovable forces within historical trends. Content summary. In Industrial Technological Society Cannot Be Reformed, the author argues that attempts to reconcile individual freedom with technological progress are impractical, citing the principles of historical and societal change laid out earlier. The section suggests that technology has continuously supported the existing societal structure at the expense of personal freedom since the Industrial Revolution, reinforcing systemic control over individual autonomy. Reforms aimed at preserving freedom within a technological society would either be temporary or require radical, society-wide disruptions with unpredictable consequences. Essentially, only a revolution could achieve lasting change. The author criticizes naive proposals for blending freedom with technology, arguing that such hypothetical societies would either collapse or deviate from their intended purpose. Interpretation. The author's views indicate a firm belief that technology and freedom cannot coexist within the same society without resulting in either a radical overhaul or a retreat to status quo. There is a clear sense of inevitability regarding the role of technology in consolidating control within the societal system, which, in the author's view, inherently conflicts with individual freedoms. This section reinforces the deterministic and somewhat fatalistic outlook presented previously, building on the principles of historical trends and complex societal interactions that render incremental reform ineffective. Analysis of accuracy. The argument reflects familiar debates within sociological, philosophical, and technological critique fields. Historical trends do suggest that industrial advancements have often correlated with centralized structures of power, as seen in industrialized nations, where technology facilitates surveillance, data control, and increased governmental or corporate oversight. However, the assumption that technology is intrinsically at odds with freedom is a matter of interpretation. Some advancements, such as digital communication and decentralized networks, have enabled forms of individual empowerment, activism, and community building that challenge centralized control, though these advances often come with trade-offs in privacy and autonomy. The argument that radical change would carry unpredictable risks aligns with theories of systemic disruption, as seen in historical revolutions that led to wide-reaching, unforeseen consequences. While it's true that reformed technological societies may struggle to maintain both freedom and systemic control, modern innovations in privacy technology and decentralized governance frameworks illustrate that hybrid models are being attempted, though their success varies. Possible motive. This section seems driven by a strong desire to critique and dismantle optimistic assumptions about reforming technological society. The author's intent appears to be to push readers away from moderate or reformist approaches, encouraging them instead to consider more radical, even revolutionary, solutions to safeguard freedom. By highlighting what they perceive as the naivety in reconciling freedom with technological advancement, the author aims to solidify a perspective that reform efforts are doomed to fail without significant systemic upheaval, implying that anything short of revolutionary change is insufficient. This section aligns with an overarching theme of skepticism towards both technology's impact on freedom and conventional reformist optimism, serving as a foundation for more specific arguments that will be developed later on. This excerpt further intensifies the author's critical view of industrial society, positioning the system as inherently restrictive and emphasizing its inability to prioritize individual freedom. Through detailed arguments, the author explains how technological advancement necessitates regulation, centralization, and uniformity in human behavior to ensure functionality. Each element of society, according to the author, is engineered to align with system needs rather than human desires, creating a pervasive sense of powerlessness among individuals. In analyzing these passages, several themes emerge that reinforce the author's previous principles. First, there's an emphasis on inevitability. Regulation is seen not as an arbitrary imposition, but as an unavoidable demand of an industrial technological society. The author claims that without rigid adherence to rules, societal production and bureaucratic order would collapse. This argument is connected to previous assertions that long-term trends, like societal dependence on technology, are resistant to reform without radical upheaval, implying that minor modifications to increase freedom are not only ineffective, but counterproductive. The author also notes a psychological adaptation in the form of propaganda, suggesting that the system encourages people to embrace behaviors aligned with its operational needs. This soft regulation shifts the mechanism of control from strict laws to persuasion, adjusting values and perceptions to sustain compliance. Psychological and educational programs are seen as tools not to elevate individual autonomy, but to subtly align people's desires with what the system demands. The author's stance on education further reveals a critical perspective on how industrial society conditions youth. Children are pressured into fields that support technological and industrial requirements, which, the author argues, stifles natural inclinations toward experiential learning and active engagement. This forced alignment with system needs, according to the author, results in dissatisfaction and disconnection among those unable to conform, contributing to social issues like disengagement, rebellion, and even antisocial behavior. The author implies that these consequences, often seen as individual failings, are, in fact, responses to an unnatural demand placed on human life by technology. On autonomy, the excerpt argues that the individual's influence diminishes as society grows more technologically interconnected. Large-scale systems demand extensive coordination and control, meaning that individuals contribute little to overarching decisions. This powerlessness, the author believes, cannot be reversed through decentralization because interconnected systems, like public utilities or media networks, tie local communities into global operations. Finally, the author touches on moral compromises, asserting that human needs are only met insofar as they benefit the system. The example of mental health illustrates this, where the concept is framed in terms of compliance with societal demands rather than individual well-being. Human desires are subordinated to technical needs, suggesting a loss of human agency to systemic requirements. Efforts to infuse autonomy into industrial work, such as allowing employees minor choices in their tasks, are viewed as inadequate or insincere because true autonomy would undermine the system's stability. In summary, the author presents a vision of industrial society as an intricate machine where human freedom is sacrificed to maintain operational efficiency. The fundamental structure of this society dictates that individuals must adapt to serve its needs, not the other way around, making genuine reform seem impractical and advocating instead for a radical overhaul to reclaim freedom. The message underscores the author's belief that the system's alignment with technical necessity, rather than human values, leads to a controlled, conformist society where freedom is increasingly elusive. In this analysis, technology is identified as a dominant social force that inevitably encroaches upon freedom, despite any attempts to reconcile or moderate its influence. The progression of technology is compared to a strong, aggressive neighbor, gradually consuming a weaker neighbor's land through a series of imposed compromises. This analogy serves to illustrate that freedom's continued existence is threatened not by direct attacks, but by a series of smaller, incremental concessions that, over time, yield significant losses. An example cited is the transformation of society through motorized transport. Initially presented as a means to enhance freedom by increasing mobility, automobiles ultimately led to a complex set of regulations, obligations, and dependencies that now restrict movement rather than liberate it. The analysis asserts that such advancements, while initially optional, often reshape society in ways that later force individuals into compliance or dependence. This reflects how technology, once introduced, changes societal structures and behaviors, often making the choice to abstain from technology effectively impossible. Technological advances are further portrayed as cumulative forces that consistently reshape societal structures, governance, and individual autonomy. Each innovation, whether it be indoor plumbing, communication tools, or genetic engineering, is presented as incrementally moving society toward a state where individuals' fates are increasingly determined by a few powerful players in politics, corporations, or technical bureaucracies. Such centralized control, although often accepted because each technological advance seems beneficial in isolation, ultimately shifts power away from individuals, making the trajectory of society difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. The analysis goes on to describe a crucial distinction between the motivations of those who drive technological advancement and those who seek to protect freedom. Individuals and organizations focused on technological and scientific pursuits are incentivized by the rewards inherent in progress and discovery. Conversely, those resisting technology's encroachment on freedom work under the discouraging task of preventing negative outcomes, making persistent and effective resistance challenging. Moreover, even if such a movement succeeded in temporarily halting technological encroachment, this victory would be transient. Technological development is described as a force that, unlike social arrangements such as laws or ethical codes, does not degrade or retreat, remaining ready to advance once societal resistance weakens. An additional, striking point made in this analysis is that technological advancements are inherently permanent within a given society. While social structures, laws, ethics, and customs can adapt or decay, technology remains poised to expand its influence as soon as any resistance falters. This reflects the notion that environmental protections, for instance, which once seemed robust, are always at risk of being eroded by political or social shifts. Finally, the analysis suggests that the industrial technological system may face significant stresses, potentially weakening it. Should these stresses cause sufficient destabilization, it is proposed that freedom's advocates might find an opportunity to mount a successful revolution against the system. However, this opportunity is framed as a rare and fleeting moment where technology's supremacy over freedom is vulnerable, an opportunity that, if not fully seized, would allow technology to once again dominate and gradually erode freedom. This analysis underscores the notion that society has struggled and often failed to address relatively straightforward social problems, suggesting that more complex issues, such as balancing freedom with technological progress, are even less likely to be resolved. A primary example given is environmental degradation, which pits short-term economic gains against long-term preservation of resources. Despite the clarity of this conflict, society's response has been marked by political posturing and inconsistency, rather than decisive action. This outcome is attributed to competing interests and the influence of public opinion, which fluctuate too unpredictably to yield effective solutions. As a result, society often muddles through problems without achieving lasting resolutions, primarily due to the self-interested motivations of various groups and the lack of coordinated, rational planning. The argument goes further, emphasizing that reconciling freedom with technology is particularly challenging because technology offers tangible benefits, while freedom is an abstract concept subject to individual interpretation. Furthermore, the erosion of freedom can be easily masked by persuasive language and societal norms, making it difficult to recognize or prioritize its preservation. The analysis also highlights a significant difference between problems like environmental degradation and the encroachment on freedom. While it might eventually be in the system's best interest to address environmental issues, preserving individual freedom and small group autonomy does not align with the system's goals. In fact, the system arguably benefits from greater control over human behavior, which is often rationalized as a necessary form of socialization. Social scientists like James Q. Wilson have even advocated for more systematic socialization as a way to maintain order and coherence in society. Therefore, the analysis suggests that while certain practical issues may be tackled out of necessity, the system is inherently inclined to curtail freedom to maintain control, often through subtle, indirect means that mask this encroachment. The text argues that dismantling the industrial technological system through revolution is more viable than attempting to reform it to preserve freedom. Revolution, in this view, involves a fundamental societal transformation rather than simply addressing individual issues. A key distinction made is that reform, while ostensibly less drastic, tends to be constrained by the incremental nature of change and the fear of going too far, making it difficult to generate the intense commitment required for lasting impact. In contrast, revolutionary movements have the advantage of promising sweeping change, which can mobilize people more effectively by appealing to a vision of a radically improved world. This grand promise provides a powerful incentive, as participants are driven not just to avoid negative consequences, but to achieve an idealized society. The argument draws on historical examples like the French and Russian revolutions, suggesting that revolutions can succeed even if only a minority fully commits to the cause. This committed group, despite being smaller in number, can often steer society by channeling the fervor and sacrifices needed to maintain momentum, eventually becoming the dominant force. This analysis implies that while reform tends to attract a gradualist approach that may lack urgency, a revolutionary movement ignites a level of dedication capable of sustaining hardships and pushing through significant resistance. The author argues that technological society increasingly seeks to control human behavior, extending beyond historical social pressures to profound modifications of individuals themselves. In traditional societies, pressures such as labor demands, physical hardship, or social conformity had natural limits, as human endurance would only tolerate so much. But modern technology allows society to modify people directly, bypassing these natural limits. The text points to several methods of this control: drugs to alleviate discontent without addressing its sources, surveillance to monitor behavior, and propaganda to shape public opinion and cultural values. Education and parenting methods are portrayed as tools for molding individuals to conform to societal expectations, while mental health and intervention programs are seen as adjusting individuals to fit seamlessly within societal structures, regardless of personal fulfillment or autonomy. Further, the author suggests that psychological techniques may prove insufficient for full compliance in the future, potentially leading to biological interventions. Advances in neurology, drugs, and genetic engineering, for example, may re-engineer individuals to fit societal demands. If stress and dissatisfaction in society lead to issues such as crime, rebellion, or mental health challenges, these technologies could be used to correct these issues by altering individuals rather than societal conditions. This implies that the system may shape people to suit its needs, rather than adapting itself to human needs. Additionally, the gradual introduction of these techniques through seemingly beneficial small steps, such as gene therapy for criminal tendencies or mandatory skills training for employment, ensures that public resistance remains minimal. Technological control is framed as a solution to societal challenges, ultimately normalizing interventions that, collectively, might drastically limit personal autonomy. The piece suggests that society could reach a point where human behavior is fully controllable, advancing from today's experimental stages to potentially total influence over human thoughts, emotions, and actions, challenging the notion of human freedom in unprecedented ways. In this excerpt, the author presents a dystopian perspective on the future of industrialized society, emphasizing a potential crossroads for humanity. The narrative paints a stark image of a system seeking dominance over human behavior through increasingly sophisticated psychological and biological manipulation. The author suggests that while scientific advancements have already proven successful in controlled settings, the larger social system has yet to fully integrate them due to the chaotic and violent realities of public institutions like schools. the text moves on to warn of a crisis in the coming decades, where humanity's future hinges on whether the system can achieve control over human behavior. If it succeeds, the author foresees an almost Orwellian landscape where human freedom dwindles under the dominance of technology and bureaucratic structures. Power would be centralized, with a select few controlling society and technological tools for manipulation. However, even these elites would be constrained by rigid norms that limit true freedom, reflecting a bleak view of institutionalized control. An alternative path is considered, a breakdown of the system leading to a period of chaos. While this scenario allows a chance for freedom to reemerge, the author expresses fear that power-driven individuals may quickly reestablish industrial society. To prevent this, the author advocates for efforts to heighten social stresses, to induce collapse, followed by the destruction of industrial remnants to prevent any chance of reconstitution. This ideological approach reveals a fundamentally anti-technological stance, proposing drastic measures to dismantle modern industry and prevent future technological advances. The author's overall message warns against the trajectory of industrial society, portraying technology not as a neutral tool, but as an instrument of control that will erode human autonomy. This anti-technological perspective challenges the premise that scientific progress is inherently beneficial, instead framing it as a path toward a regulated, depersonalized future unless actively disrupted. The author here grapples with the ethical and existential implications of a possible breakdown of the industrial system, examining whether such an event, however disastrous, might ultimately be less harmful than the continuation of the current technological trajectory. Arguing that the system is inherently unsustainable, the author suggests it may collapse on its own, but with the help of revolutionaries, this breakdown could occur sooner, potentially limiting the extent of long-term suffering. The author explores the idea that human suffering may be inevitable, regardless of whether industrial society continues or collapses. The portrayal of technology is deeply critical, asserting that the Industrial Revolution's promises of eradicating poverty and creating universal happiness have fallen flat. Rather than liberating humanity, the author argues, industrialization has exacerbated social and environmental issues, destabilized ancient cultures, and contributed to global overpopulation. The author implies that the rise of advanced technology has done more harm than good by disrupting natural balances and creating new dependencies that threaten human autonomy. In this view, the idea that science will fix all social and environmental problems is dismissed as overly optimistic and historically misguided. The author is skeptical of technophiles who claim that advancements, such as genetically engineered crops to prevent famine, will solve systemic issues, arguing that such solutions may actually worsen the underlying problems by fueling population growth and exacerbating psychological and social stresses. This criticism extends to the unpredictability of technological progress itself, suggesting that each new solution brings unforeseen consequences that often outweigh any benefits. Ultimately, the author questions whether continued technological progress is worth the sacrifice of freedom and dignity, raising the moral dilemma of choosing between a regulated, secure life under technological control and the uncertain, potentially painful existence that might follow the collapse of industrial society. The author concludes that the survival of the industrial system will not necessarily reduce suffering. It may, in fact, increase it by trapping humanity in a cycle of endless solutions that only deepen societal problems. This argument reflects a deep unease with the promises of modernity, advocating for a radical rethinking of technological dependence before humanity becomes irreversibly bound to it. The author in these passages speculates on the possible futures of industrial society and the transformative impact of advanced technology on human life. They explore several potential scenarios that might arise if industrial society continues, each posing questions about freedom, autonomy, and the eventual fate of humanity. One of the primary scenarios considered is the development of highly intelligent machines that could potentially handle all tasks more efficiently than humans. The author describes two potential outcomes of such advancements: one where machines gain complete autonomy, and another where control over machines is retained by a powerful elite. In the first case, the author warns of humanity becoming utterly dependent on machines, so much so that turning them off would no longer be feasible, thereby relinquishing any real control. In the second case, control would rest with a select elite, while the masses become either a burden or, at best, managed subjects, likened to domestic animals. This controlled society would pacify the masses through psychological or biological engineering, ultimately removing their autonomy and reducing them to a state of purposeless dependence. The author then considers a scenario where artificial intelligence, AI, fails to fully replace human work, yet technology still takes over simpler tasks, leaving many people redundant. In this future, the author envisions a workforce increasingly specialized and conditioned to fit the system's needs, competing only within narrow, system-defined channels. Human creativity and individuality in this vision are subsumed by the system's demands, as people are socially and biologically engineered to be docile, function-focused, and stripped of meaningful power. Further, the author imagines a service society where people are busy with unimportant or trivial jobs. In this scenario, the author finds such work demeaning and predicts that people forced into these roles might turn to self-destructive behaviors if they're not artificially conditioned to accept their circumstances. The author deems this a hollow end for humanity, one that fails to provide true fulfillment or meaning. The text paints a grim picture of the industrial technological future, portraying it as one where people become ever more dependent on organizations, lose control over their destinies, and live in environments designed not by nature, but by technological forces. The author views this transformation as inevitable unless there is a radical departure from the current trajectory. Concluding, the author proposes that it would be preferable to dismantle the system entirely, suggesting that a return to a simpler state, though risky, might offer humanity a more authentic and free existence than the manufactured future envisioned here. The text focuses on strategies to dismantle industrial society, with the primary objective of eradicating modern technology and its societal control. The author's approach is methodical, aiming to replicate the historical patterns of the French and Russian revolutions. This strategy includes fostering social instability, promoting an ideology valuing wild nature, and opposing technological advancements. The core message insists that true change requires not just opposition, but a clear, compelling ideal. The author envisions nature as this ideal, contrasting it with the mechanistic, controlling aspects of technology. The author also emphasizes cultivating a dedicated, rational minority to counter industrial society's influence, rather than aiming to sway the majority. The intention is to gradually destabilize the technological system by framing technology as a means for a powerful elite to control the masses, thus positioning the public as unwitting victims rather than enablers of technological dominance. Another layer of the strategy suggests avoiding political involvement, even if anti-technological ideologies gain popularity, until the industrial system collapses under its own strain. This section further advocates for unity in revolutionary efforts across nations, warning that isolated efforts would likely fail due to the interdependence and competitive nature of global economies. The author presents an uncompromising stance. Technology must be entirely removed to prevent its reemergence, cautioning against any concessions that could lead to reliance on technological infrastructure, even if the aim is seemingly noble, like achieving social justice. The message also suggests that personal and small group power can flourish once the industrial system is dismantled, as individuals in pre-industrial societies had greater autonomy. The document concludes with a rather controversial suggestion, urging revolutionaries to have more children to sustain anti-technological sentiment for future generations, reasoning that this will help ensure the continued opposition to technology. The author's perspective is radical, rejecting technological advancement and asserting that human control over nature through large organizations diminishes individual autonomy and connection to nature. This viewpoint illustrates the underlying conflict between two contrasting ideals: the natural world's inherent autonomy versus the artificial order imposed by technological society. The author's message targets those skeptical of industrial society's long-term sustainability and presents a vision that borders on extreme primitivism, calling for the eventual dissolution of all industrial and technological systems to foster a simpler, decentralized way of life. This passage presents an argument that frames leftism as an ideological force that, if unchecked, can lead to authoritarianism and societal control under the guise of social responsibility and justice. The text characterizes leftism as inherently collectivist, viewing individuals primarily as part of a social organism rather than as autonomous entities. According to the author, leftists are driven by a psychological need to enforce their moral outlook on society, often without regard for individual freedoms, especially when these freedoms clash with their collective ideals. The text asserts that as leftists gain influence in institutions or movements, they alter these spaces' original goals, shifting them toward a collectivist agenda reliant on technological systems and centralized control. A core claim is that leftism is not only collectivist, but also totalitarian, with its adherents allegedly seeking to control all aspects of society to fulfill a power-driven need. The author draws historical parallels, such as the transformation of the Bolshevik movement from a stance against censorship to becoming highly repressive once in power, arguing that this demonstrates a recurring pattern where leftist movements eventually impose the very restrictions they initially opposed. In addition, the text distinguishes leftists from other types of ideologically committed individuals, specifically true believers, as defined by Eric Hoffer. The true believer's dedication to a cause can potentially destabilize movements intended to oppose technology and collectivism, a problem for those who might wish to align with such causes. Further, the author attempts to create a framework for identifying leftist traits, such as support for gun control, affirmative action, and rights-based activism for marginalized groups. Leftism is positioned as a quasi-religious faith, with its followers allegedly viewing alternative perspectives as inherently wrong. This contrasts leftists with libertarian-leaning anarchists, who are described as preferring individual or small group autonomy over broader social control. Finally, the author suggests that while some leftists may seem tolerant and reasonable, their psychological need for moral control ultimately drives them to support or condone authoritarian actions when given power. This, according to the text, demonstrates an underlying threat that leftism poses to freedom and individualism. This text offers a dense, polemical critique of leftism, focusing on what the author interprets as its psychological underpinnings and its supposed opposition to individual freedom and technological restraint. The writing is detailed and highly ideological, employing broad, often negative characterizations of leftism that paint it as power-driven, collectivist, and inherently at odds with personal autonomy and natural harmony. The analysis provided is unwavering in its skepticism toward leftist ideologies, casting them as ultimately authoritarian forces cloaked in moral or egalitarian aims. Several key themes emerge throughout the text. First, there's the claim that leftism attracts those who are, consciously or unconsciously, drawn to power through identification with collective causes, and that it often distorts its professed goals. This perspective is presented as something of a cautionary tale, warning that leftism's proclaimed compassion and collectivism ultimately lead to centralized control and the erosion of personal freedoms. There's a stark binary here, with leftism on one side and a kind of individualistic, anti-technology, pro-nature stance on the other, and the author does little to consider any possible nuance or middle ground. From an analytical perspective, this piece has both strengths and notable weaknesses. On one hand, it's a well-structured argument that builds methodically, using examples from history to support its claims and attempting to make a consistent case against leftism as the author perceives it. The consistent narrative voice and logical flow give the piece a sense of coherence and determination that may be compelling to readers inclined to view leftism skeptically. There's also an effort to root these critiques in broader sociological and psychological insights, adding a sense of intellectual depth, if not balance, to the arguments. However, there are significant limitations that affect the strength and reliability of this analysis. One prominent issue is the sweeping generalizations made about what constitutes leftism. The author admits that the term is vaguely defined and that leftist movements encompass a wide array of ideologies and aims, yet proceeds with a reductive framework that treats leftism as a monolithic force. For example, although the author associates leftism with collectivism and authoritarianism, these traits could just as easily be found in far-right movements or other ideological frameworks. There's little acknowledgement of leftist traditions that are highly individualistic or libertarian in nature, such as certain strands of anarchism or anti-authoritarian socialism, which don't fit neatly into the author's model of power-driven collectivism. Moreover, the text's psychological claims about leftists, that they are motivated by feelings of inferiority, a desire for victimhood identification, or a need for power, rely heavily on speculation. While these may seem plausible in specific cases, they lack empirical backing in the text, which offers no concrete data, psychological studies, or rigorous examination of these assertions. Rather, the author uses anecdotal and historical examples that reinforce personal biases more than they provide an objective view. There's also the matter of confirmation bias, examples that would challenge the author's argument, like non-authoritarian leftist movements, are largely ignored or minimized. The historical analogies are intriguing but selectively applied. For instance, the Bolsheviks are used as a case study to showcase leftism's supposed authoritarian drift, but the author doesn't account for right-wing authoritarianism or the ways that leftist and rightist movements have converged in various historical contexts. This selective history could mislead readers who aren't aware of the diverse trajectories leftist movements have taken around the world. It's a narrative with an evident agenda, which is fine in opinion writing, but here it masquerades as a neutral sociological analysis. The polemical tone, combined with this selective interpretation, risks alienating readers who might have otherwise found some value in the author's caution about ideological movements and power dynamics. Finally, while the concluding statements show a level of humility by acknowledging potential flaws in the argument, they don't quite mitigate the overall impression that this is more an ideological screed than a balanced analysis. The author's worldview is firmly anti-leftist, and this perspective permeates every argument, leaving little room for genuine exploration of opposing perspectives or even an unbiased critique of the left. The text doesn't so much invite dialogue as seek to persuade or even convert through a relentless string of judgments and assertions. In sum, while the piece is ambitious and offers an intense critique of what the author perceives as leftist motives and consequences, it ultimately falls short as an objective analysis. It's more useful as a study in how certain ideological views interpret and rationalize the opposing side, rather than a balanced exploration of leftism itself. The value here might lie in understanding how ideological divides shape discourse, especially when the desire to critique overrides the pursuit of comprehensive truth. The text, with its certainty and pointed critiques, likely serves more as a rhetorical or ideological stance than as an earnest effort to understand or depict leftism in all its complexity.